The milk carton exploded against the sidewalk like a small white bomb, sending its contents cascading across the concrete in a pale river that caught the afternoon light. I stood there, frozen, watching $27 worth of groceries scatter across the pavement. Apples rolling into the gutter, pasta boxes splitting open. My carefully planned week of meals reduced to chaos in a single clumsy moment. Shit, I whispered, the word barely audible even to myself. I'd been juggling too many things again. Phone wedged between my shoulder and ear, keys dangling from my pinky, paper bags straining against my grip while my mother's voice droned through the speaker about her latest drama with the neighbors. I should have made 2 trips up to my 3rd-floor apartment. Should have been more careful. Should have been paying attention instead of letting my mind wander to the endless list of things I needed to do, bills I needed to pay, the crushing weight of another ordinary day in an ordinary life that felt like it was slowly suffocating me. Daniel? Daniel, are you there? My mother's voice crackled through the phone, now lying face down in a puddle of spilled milk. I bent down to retrieve it, my knees hitting the wet pavement. The screen was cracked, a spider web of fractured glass that seemed to mirror how I felt inside most days, broken, fragmented, barely holding together. I'm here, Mom, I said, though I wasn't sure I meant it. Where was I, really? 26 years old, living alone in a cramped apartment, working a dead-end job at an insurance office where I pushed papers around all day, and pretended to care about other people's problems, while my own seemed to multiply in the shadows. What was that noise? It sounded like something broke. Just dropped some groceries. I started gathering the salvageable items, trying to ignore the curious stares from passers-by. A middle-aged woman in a pristine jogging outfit stepped carefully around the mess, her expression a mixture of pity and disgust that made my cheeks burn with embarrassment. You need to be more careful, honey. You've always been so clumsy. There it was, that casual cruelty disguised as concern that my mother had perfected over the years. The kind of comment that burrowed under your skin and stayed there, festering. I bit back the response I wanted to give and focused on rescuing a can of tomatoes that had rolled toward the street. I know, Mom. I'll be more careful. Good. Now, as I was saying about Mrs. Henderson, I tuned out again, letting her voice fade into background noise as I surveyed the damage. Half my groceries were ruined, the milk carton completely empty, and I was kneeling on a public sidewalk like some kind of vagrant. This was my life, a series of small disasters and bigger disappointments connected by long stretches of grinding monotony. As I reached for the last apple, something caught my eye. Feet. Well-worn brown leather shoes, the kind that spoke of quality and age, of someone who took care of their things. My gaze traveled upward. Dark jeans, a forest green sweater with a small hole near the left elbow, hands that looked strong but gentle, long fingers that seemed like they might know how to fix things. Here, let me help you with that. The voice was warm, deeper than I'd expected, with just a hint of roughness around the edges. I looked up and found myself staring into the most extraordinary eyes I'd ever seen. Not quite brown, not quite green, but some shifting color in between that seemed to change with the light. He was older than me, maybe late 30s or early 40s, with dark hair touched by premature silver at the temples and lines around his eyes that spoke of laughter and sorrow in equal measure. It was Marcus, my upstairs neighbor. The quiet man who lived in 4B, who I'd seen maybe a dozen times in the 2 years I'd lived in this building but had never actually spoken to. He kept to himself, moving through the hallways like a ghost, always carrying books or papers, always looking slightly lost in thought. I'd wondered about him sometimes, late at night when the building was quiet and I could hear his footsteps above me, steady and purposeful, like he was pacing out the boundaries of his solitude. "Oh," I stammered, suddenly hyper-aware of my appearance, grass-stained knees, milk-soaked shirt, hair falling into my eyes. "You don't have to—" "It's no trouble," he said, already bending down to help gather the scattered items. His movements were efficient but unhurried, and I noticed how carefully he handled each rescued can and box, as if they were precious artifacts rather than mundane groceries. "Daniel? Daniel, what's happening?" My mother's voice shrieked from the phone, still clutched in my trembling hand. "I have to go, Mom. I'll call you back." I ended the call before she could protest, shoving the damaged phone into my pocket. "Family," Marcus said with a knowing smile that transformed his entire face. It wasn't mocking or condescending, just understanding, as if he knew exactly what it felt like to have someone's voice in your ear, picking at your flaws like a persistent itch. "Yeah," I managed, accepting the items he handed me. Our fingers brushed as he passed me a box of crackers, and I felt a jolt of electricity that had nothing to do with static. His skin was warm, slightly rough, and for a moment neither of us pulled away. "I'm Marcus," he said, straightening up and extending his hand properly. "I live upstairs, 4B. Daniel, 3A. I shook his hand, trying to ignore the way his grip seemed to anchor me, making me feel more present in my own skin than I had in months. "I know. I've seen you around." "Have you?" There was something in his tone, surprise maybe, or pleasure, that made me look at him more closely. Had he noticed me too? The thought sent a warm flutter through my chest that I tried to suppress. We stood there for a moment, surrounded by the detritus of my disaster, and I became acutely aware of how close we were standing. I could smell his cologne, something woody and subtle, and see the small scar above his left eyebrow, the way his sweater brought out the green flecks in those impossible eyes. "Well," I said finally, because the silence was becoming charged with something I didn't dare name. "Thank you for helping." "You didn't have to." "I wanted to." The simplicity of his answer caught me off guard. When was the last time someone had wanted to help me with anything? When was the last time someone had looked at me the way he was looking at me now, with genuine interest, as if I were worth paying attention to? "I should probably head up," I continued, gesturing toward our building with my free hand. "Try to salvage what's left of my dignity." He laughed then, a sound so rich and genuine that it seemed to light something up inside my chest. "I don't think your dignity's beyond repair. We've all been there. Have you ever dropped your entire week's worth of groceries on the sidewalk while your mother lectures you about being more careful?" "No," he admitted, still smiling. "But I once locked myself out of my apartment wearing nothing but a towel while trying to get my mail, Mrs. Chen from 2A still won't make eye contact with me." The image made me laugh despite myself. This composed, dignified man standing in the hallway in nothing but a towel, probably maintaining that same quiet grace even in mortification. "That's actually worse than this," I said. "Much worse. At least you're fully clothed." There was something in the way he said it, a warmth that made my cheeks flush. Was he flirting with me? The thought seemed impossible. Men like Marcus, sophisticated, put together, devastatingly attractive, didn't flirt with disasters like me. Did they? "I should let you get inside," he said, but he made no move to leave. "Get cleaned up." Yes, I should, but I didn't want him to go. For the first time in months, maybe years, I was having an actual conversation with another human being. Not the forced pleasantries with coworkers or the guilt-laden calls with my mother, but real communication. The kind where you found yourself wanting to know more about the other person, wanting to make them laugh again just to hear that warm sound. "Daniel? Yeah? If you need anything, milk or whatever got ruined, I have extras. I tend to overbuy." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that seemed unconsciously nervous. "If you want. No pressure." My heart did something complicated in my chest. That's really nice of you. Thank you." "I'm usually home in the evenings," he said, then seemed to catch himself. "Not that you have to come by. I just meant, if you need anything." "I might take you up on that," I heard myself saying, surprised by my own boldness. "I hope you do." The words hung between us for a moment, weighted with possibilities I was afraid to examine too closely. Then a car honked somewhere nearby, breaking the spell, and we both seemed to remember where we were. "I should really go clean this up," I said, gesturing at the milk puddle that was slowly making its way toward the storm drain. "Of course." "I'll see you around?" "Yeah, see you around." He started to walk toward the building's entrance, then turned back. "Daniel?" "Yeah?" I'm glad we finally got a chance to talk. Before I could process what that meant, the word finally suggesting he'd been wanting this conversation as much as I had, he was gone, disappearing through the heavy glass doors with that same quiet grace I'd observed from a distance. I stood there for another moment, clutching my salvaged groceries and trying to make sense of what had just happened. Marcus from 4B had not only helped me clean up my mess, but had invited me to his apartment, had seemed genuinely interested in talking to me, had said he was glad we'd finally gotten a chance to talk, as if he'd been thinking about it. The rational part of my brain, the part that had been trained by years of disappointment and rejection, told me not to read too much into it. He was just being neighborly, kind, the way decent people are when they see someone having a bad day. But there had been something in his eyes, in the way he'd lingered, in the careful way he'd touched my hand when passing me those groceries. Something that made my pulse quicken and my thoughts scatter like dandelion seeds on the wind. I climbed the 3 flights to my apartment in a daze, my ruined groceries feeling weightless in my arms. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt alive. Alert. Like something significant had shifted in the careful routine of my days. Inside my small apartment, I set the surviving groceries on the kitchen counter and surveyed the damage. I'd lost the milk, obviously, plus several other items that had been too damaged to save. Normally, this would have sent me spiraling into one of my dark moods, brooding about money wasted, about my own clumsiness, about how I couldn't even manage the simple task of carrying groceries without fucking it up. But today was different. Today I found myself replaying Marcus's laugh, the warmth in his voice when he'd said my name, the way his eyes had seemed to hold mine just a beat too long. I caught myself smiling at my reflection in the bathroom mirror as I washed the milk off my hands, and the expression looked foreign on my face, genuine happiness so rare I barely recognized it. The rest of the afternoon passed in a strange haze of distraction. I tried to work on some freelance graphic design projects, but my mind kept wandering. I found myself listening for sounds from the apartment above, footsteps, running water, anything that would confirm Marcus's presence. Around 6, I heard what sounded like jazz music drifting down through the thin walls, and I wondered what he did for work, what his apartment looked like, whether he cooked dinner for himself or ordered takeout like I usually did. I'd lived in this building for 2 years without really knowing any of my neighbors. Mrs. Chen in 2A sometimes nodded politely when we passed in the hallway. The college students in 3B threw loud parties that I was never invited to. The elderly man in 4A had died 6 months ago, and I hadn't even realized until I saw the estate sale signs posted in the lobby. But Marcus had been different from the beginning. There was something about him that had caught my attention even in our brief, wordless encounters. The way he moved with such quiet purpose. The books he carried. Thick, serious-looking volumes that suggested hidden depths, the careful way he dressed, as if he took pride in his appearance without being vain about it. I'd made up stories about him in my head during the long, lonely evenings. Maybe he was a professor at the university downtown, or a writer working on the great American novel, or an artist of some kind. He had those long, elegant fingers that seemed made for creating beautiful things. The reality was probably much more mundane. He was probably an accountant or a middle manager or something equally ordinary. But even that didn't diminish the spark of interest I'd felt when he looked at me, really looked at me, as if I were someone worth seeing. By 8 o'clock, I was pacing my small living room like a caged animal. The milk situation had become my excuse. I needed milk for my morning coffee, after all. It would be perfectly reasonable to take him up on his offer. Neighborly, even. But what if he'd just been being polite? What if showing up at his door made me look desperate or presumptuous? What if he was busy, or eating dinner, or had company over? The internal debate raged for another hour before I finally worked up the courage to act. I changed into a clean shirt. Nothing too obvious, just a dark blue button-down that I knew looked good on me, and ran a hand through my hair to tame the worst of its unruliness. Standing outside his door, my hand raised to knock, I felt like a teenager working up the nerve to ask someone to prom. My heart was hammering so loudly I was sure he'd be able to hear it through the thin walls. What was wrong with me? This was just a neighbor offering to share some milk. Nothing more, nothing less. But even as I told myself this, I knew it wasn't entirely true. There had been something in that moment on the sidewalk, a connection, a spark, a recognition of some kind. I wasn't imagining it. Was I? I knocked before I could lose my nerve. Soft at first, then a bit louder when I realized he might not have heard. Footsteps approached, and then the door opened to reveal Marcus in casual clothes, jeans and a soft gray Henley that hugged his frame in ways that made my mouth go dry. His hair was slightly mussed, as if he'd been running his hands through it, and there was something almost vulnerable about seeing him this way, more relaxed than he'd been in the hallway earlier. "Daniel," he said, and I loved the way my name sounded in his voice. "Hi. Hi. I hope I'm not interrupting anything. You mentioned the milk situation earlier, and I realized I actually do need some for tomorrow morning's coffee." The words tumbled out in a rush, and I forced myself to slow down. "If the offer's still open, I mean." "Of course it is. Come in." He stepped back, gesturing me inside, and I got my first glimpse of his world. His apartment had the same layout as mine, but it felt completely different. Where my place was sparse and functional, a few pieces of second-hand furniture, bare walls, the general aesthetic of someone who'd never quite settled in, his was warm and lived in. Books everywhere, not just on shelves but stacked on every available surface. Rich colors and soft textures that invited you to sit and stay a while. Art on the walls, real art, not just posters or prints, but actual paintings and photographs that looked like they'd been chosen with care. "This is beautiful," I said, and meant it. "Thank you. It's taken me a few years to get it right." He moved toward the kitchen, and I followed, taking in more details. A chess set on a side table, the pieces positioned mid-game as if he'd been playing against himself. A record player with a stack of vinyl albums beside it. Windows dressed with actual curtains instead of the cheap blinds that came with the apartment. This was how adults lived, I realized. This was what it looked like when someone had their life together, when they'd moved beyond simply existing and started actually living. "Coffee or tea?" he asked, already reaching for the refrigerator. "Or something stronger, if you're in the mood." "Coffee would be great, actually." I perched on one of his bar stools, hyper-aware of every detail, the way his shoulders moved as he worked, the careful precision with which he measured the coffee grounds, the jazz music playing softly from speakers I couldn't see. "I was just listening to some Miles Davis," he said, as if reading my mind. "Hope you don't mind jazz." "I love it," I lied, then immediately felt guilty. I'd never really listened to jazz, but something about the smoky, complex melodies filling his apartment made me want to understand it, to develop the kind of sophisticated taste that would make me worthy of being here. "Really?" He turned to look at me, genuine pleasure lighting up his features. "Most people your age think it's old-fashioned. Most people my age think a lot of things are old-fashioned." The comment slipped out before I could stop it, and I felt heat rise in my cheeks. Had I just referenced our age difference? Made it weird? But Marcus just smiled. Fair point. I suppose I'm getting old enough to start complaining about kids these days and their music. You're not old, I said quickly, then realized that might sound even weirder. 39 last month. Ancient by most standards. 39 isn't ancient. It's... I searched for the right word. Distinguished. He laughed, that same rich sound that had affected me so strongly earlier. Distinguished. I like that better than over the hill. The coffee maker gurgled to life, filling the comfortable silence between us. I found myself relaxing despite my nerves, drawn into the warm atmosphere of his home. This was what I'd been missing, I realized. Not just human connection, but this specific quality of connection. Easy conversation with someone who seemed genuinely interested in what I had to say. So, what do you do? I asked, because it seemed like the natural next question, and because I was genuinely curious about this man who'd created such a beautiful space for himself. I own a bookstore, he said, leaning against the counter as the coffee brewed. Well, it's more like a used bookstore. Small place downtown, near the old theater district. It's not exactly a thriving business model these days, but I love it. A bookstore? Of course. It explained the books everywhere, the thoughtful way he spoke, the quiet intelligence I'd sensed in him from our brief encounters. I could picture him there, surrounded by towering shelves, helping customers find exactly the right book for their mood or moment. That sounds amazing, I said. I love books. I used to read a lot more when I was younger. I've gotten out of the habit lately. What changed? The question was simple, but something in his tone suggested he really wanted to know. When was the last time someone had asked me about myself with such genuine curiosity? I don't know, I said slowly, trying to articulate something I'd never really examined. Life, I guess. Work gets busy, and by the time I get home, I'm usually too tired to focus on anything that requires real attention. I end up just watching Netflix or scrolling through my phone until I fall asleep. Ah, he nodded understanding. The modern malaise. We've forgotten how to be alone with our thoughts. Is that what it is? Maybe. Or maybe we're just afraid of what we might find if we sit quietly long enough. The observation hit uncomfortably close to home. How many evenings had I spent deliberately distracting myself from the silence of my apartment, from the weight of my own loneliness? You might be right about that, I admitted. The coffee finished brewing and he poured 2 mugs, adding cream to both without asking how I liked it. Somehow he'd guessed right, just enough to soften the bitterness without masking the flavor. So, what do you do? He asked, settling onto the stool beside me. We were close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his body, could catch that subtle cologne again. Insurance, I said, then immediately felt the need to elaborate. Claims processing, mostly. It's not exactly exciting, but it pays the bills. Do you like it? Another simple question that felt loaded with meaning. Did I like it? The honest answer was that I'd never really considered whether liking my job was an option. It was something I did to survive, not something I'd chosen out of passion or interest. No, I said, surprised by my own honesty. Not really. I kind of fell into it after college and just stayed. It's steady work. What did you study in college? Art history. I felt heat rise in my cheeks again. I know. Completely useless degree. Everyone told me I'd never find work with it, and they were right. Art history isn't useless, Marcus said firmly. Understanding beauty, understanding how humans have tried to make sense of their world through creative expression, that's never useless. The conviction in his voice made me look at him more closely. You really believe that? Absolutely. The world needs people who understand art, who can see beauty and meaning where others might see just pretty pictures or old junk. That's a gift, Daniel. No one had ever called my education a gift before. My parents had tolerated it with resigned disappointment, My coworkers made jokes about my fancy book learning, and I'd internalized their dismissal so completely that I'd stopped thinking of my degree as anything but an expensive mistake. I haven't used it much since graduation, I said quietly. Sometimes I wonder if I remember any of it. It's like riding a bicycle. It comes back. He took a sip of his coffee, studying me over the rim of his mug. You should come by the store sometime. I get a lot of art books, estate sales, collections, things like that. You might find something interesting. I'd like that, I said, meaning it completely. Good. His smile was warm, genuine. I don't get many customers who actually understand what they're looking at. Most people just want the latest bestseller or whatever's being made into a movie. That must be frustrating. Sometimes. But then someone comes in who really gets it, who sees a book as more than just entertainment, and it makes all the slow days worthwhile. There was something in the way he said it, in the way he was looking at me, that made me wonder if we were still talking about books. The air between us felt charged again, the way it had on the sidewalk earlier. What kind of art books do you have? I asked, trying to keep the conversation on safe ground. Everything. Renaissance masters, modern photography, architecture, design. I had someone donate an entire collection of exhibition catalogs from the Met last month. Beautiful stuff. Barely touched. His enthusiasm was infectious. I found myself leaning closer as he described some of his recent acquisitions, drawn in by the passion in his voice. This was clearly more than just a job for him. It was a calling, a way of connecting with something larger than himself. You really love what you do, I observed. I do. It doesn't make much money, and some days I wonder if I'm completely crazy for trying to keep an independent bookstore alive in the age of Amazon, but... He shrugged. It feels important. Like I'm preserving something valuable. You are, I said with sudden conviction. Places like that, they matter. They're like cultural sanctuaries. Cultural sanctuaries. He repeated the phrase thoughtfully. I like that. You have a way with words. The compliment sent warmth spreading through my chest. When was the last time someone had praised anything about me that wasn't job-related? When was the last time anyone had noticed I had a way with words? Thank you, I said softly. For what? For saying that. For seeing that. Something shifted in his expression, becoming softer, more intense. You seem surprised that someone would notice. I guess I am. I don't get a lot of compliments in my daily life. That's a shame, he said quietly. You deserve better than that. The words hung between us, weighted with meaning I was afraid to fully acknowledge. My heart was racing again, and I realized we'd somehow moved even closer together. Close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in his eyes, could count the small freckles across the bridge of his nose. Marcus, I said, not sure what I intended to follow it with. Yeah? I should probably... I gestured vaguely toward the door, though leaving was the last thing I actually wanted to do. Should probably what? Let you get back to your evening. I just came for the milk, and I've been here for... I glanced at my watch and was shocked to see that nearly 2 hours had passed. It had felt like minutes. Has it been boring? He asked, and there was something almost vulnerable in the question. No, I said immediately. God, no. This has been the best conversation I've had in months, maybe years. Then why do you want to leave? The directness of the question caught me off guard. Why did I want to leave? Because this felt too good to be real? Because I was terrified of reading too much into his kindness? Because the way he was looking at me was making me hope for things that seemed impossible? I don't, I admitted quietly. Want to leave, I mean. Then don't. The simple statement hung between us like a challenge. Don't leave. Stay here in this warm, book-filled apartment with this incredible man who seemed genuinely interested in what I had to say. Stay and see what might happen if I stopped running away from every good thing that tried to enter my life. I don't want to overstay my welcome, I said. You're not. He reached out and touched my hand where it rested on the counter, just a light brush of his fingers against mine. But the contact sent electricity shooting up my arm and straight to my chest. I like having you here, Daniel. I like talking to you. I like talking to you too, I whispered. We sat there in comfortable silence for a moment, his fingers still touching mine, both of us seeming to acknowledge that something significant was happening without quite daring to name it. Are you hungry? He asked finally. I was about to make dinner when you knocked. Nothing fancy, just pasta and whatever's left in my refrigerator, but you're welcome to stay. Stay for dinner. The offer felt monumental, loaded with implications that made my pulse race. This wasn't just neighborly kindness anymore. This was something else, something that felt dangerously close to what I'd been secretly hoping for. I'd like that, I said. If you're sure I'm not imposing. You're not imposing, he said firmly. Trust me. So I stayed. I helped him chop vegetables while he cooked pasta, our movements in the small kitchen bringing us into frequent casual contact, his hand on my shoulder as he reached for something behind me, our hips bumping as we maneuvered around each other, the brush of his fingers when he handed me a wine glass. Each touch felt deliberate, charged with meaning but also perfectly natural, as if we'd been doing this dance for years instead of hours. We ate at his small dining table, talking about books and movies and places we'd traveled or wanted to travel. He told me about opening the bookstore 5 years ago, about the leap of faith it had taken to leave his corporate job and pursue something that made him happy instead of just wealthy. I told him about my college years, about the professors who'd opened my eyes to beauty I'd never noticed before, about the dreams I'd abandoned when real life got in the way. You talk about your dreams like they're dead, he observed, refilling my wine glass. But you're 26. You have decades ahead of you to pursue whatever you want. It's not that simple, I protested. I have bills, responsibilities. I can't just quit my job and hope everything works out. Can't you? What's the worst that could happen? I could end up broke and homeless? Could you? Really? He leaned forward, fixing me with that intense gaze. You're smart, talented, educated. You have skills and interests and a way of seeing the world that's uniquely yours. Even if you failed at whatever dream you decided to pursue, which is a big if, you'd find a way to survive. People always do. You make it sound so easy. It's not easy, he said, but it's possible. And isn't the possibility of building a life you actually want worth some risk? The question hit me like a physical blow. When had I stopped believing that happiness was possible? When had I accepted that life was just something to endure rather than something to actively create? I don't know, I said honestly. I haven't thought about it that way in a long time. Maybe it's time to start. After dinner, we moved to his couch with fresh glasses of wine. The jazz had shifted to something slower, more intimate, and the lamp beside the couch cast everything in a warm, golden glow. I felt loose and comfortable in a way I hadn't experienced in years, whether from the wine or the company or the simple pleasure of being seen and heard by another human being. Can I ask you something? I said, curled up on one end of the couch while he occupied the other. Anything. Earlier, when you helped me with the groceries, you said you were glad we'd finally gotten a chance to talk. Did you mean that? Had you been thinking about talking to me? He was quiet for a long moment, swirling his wine in its glass. Yes, he said finally. I had been thinking about it. Why didn't you ever say anything? Another pause. Because you're 26 and beautiful, and you have your whole life ahead of you. And I'm pushing 40, set in my ways, probably boring by your standards. I figured you'd humor the lonely old bookstore owner for a few minutes and then find an excuse to leave. You're not old, I said automatically, and you're definitely not boring. No? No, you're... I searched for the right words. You're interesting, thoughtful. You make me want to be smarter, more curious about things. You make me feel like maybe I'm worth having a conversation with. Daniel, he said softly, and there was something in his voice that made me look up from my wine glass. He was looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, tender, intense, maybe a little sad. You are absolutely worth having a conversation with, worth knowing. Anyone who doesn't see that is an idiot. The sincerity in his voice made my throat tight. You don't really know me yet. Don't I? He shifted slightly on the couch, angling toward me. I know you're kind. You apologized to me for dropping your groceries, as if it was something that affected me personally. I know you're intelligent, the way you talk about art, about books, about ideas. I know you're thoughtful. You've been listening to everything I've said tonight, really listening, not just waiting for your turn to talk. Those could just be surface things. Could be. But I don't think they are. He set down his wine glass and gave me his full attention. I think you're someone who feels things deeply, who sees beauty where others might miss it, who's maybe been told you're too sensitive or too idealistic or too something by people who don't understand what a gift that is. I stared at him, stunned by the accuracy of his assessment. How could he see me so clearly when we'd only just met? How could he articulate things about myself that I'd never been able to put into words? How do you know all that? I whispered. Because I recognize it, he said simply. It takes one to know one, I guess. The admission hung between us, creating a bubble of intimacy that felt almost sacred. We were both sensitive souls, both people who felt too much in a world that valued emotional detachment, both lonely in ways that had nothing to do with physical solitude and everything to do with the specific isolation of being misunderstood. Marcus, I said, his name feeling precious on my tongue. Yeah. I wanted to tell him how much this night had meant to me, how he'd made me feel more like myself than I had in years, how the way he looked at me made me want to be worthy of his attention. But the words felt too big, too loaded with implications I wasn't ready to examine. Instead, I said, thank you. For tonight, for dinner, for the conversation, for... I gestured helplessly. For seeing me. Thank you for letting me. We fell into comfortable silence, the kind that doesn't need to be filled with words. The wine and the warmth of his apartment had made me drowsy, and I found my eyelids getting heavy. I should go home, I thought distantly. It was getting late and I had work in the morning, but I couldn't make myself move. This couch, this apartment, this man, it all felt like home in a way my own place never had. Safe and warm and exactly where I belonged. I should probably head downstairs, I said eventually, though I made no move to get up. Should you? His voice was soft, almost hypnotic. It's getting late. It is. But neither of us moved. We stayed there, looking at each other in the lamplight, and I felt the weight of everything unspoken between us. The attraction that had been simmering under the surface all evening. The connection that felt both brand new and ancient, as if we'd been circling each other for years instead of hours. Daniel, he said quietly. Yeah. My lonely older neighbor changed my life forever. Gay Story, Part 2. The words hung between us like something fragile and precious. You don't have to go yet, if you don't want to. Richard's voice carried a vulnerability that made my chest tighten, and I found myself frozen in his doorway, one hand on the frame, the other still reaching for the handle I'd never quite grasped. Time seemed to stretch and compress simultaneously. I could hear my own heartbeat, could feel the weight of the decision settling over me like a blanket. Outside, the first drops of evening rain began to tap against the windows, gentle at first, then with more insistence, as if the weather itself was conspiring to keep me here. I turned back to face him, and the expression in his eyes took my breath away. There was hope there, yes, but also fear. The kind of raw, exposed fear that comes from asking for something you need but aren't sure you deserve. His hands were trembling slightly at his sides, and I realized this invitation had cost him something significant to offer. I started, then stopped, the words tangling in my throat. What was I supposed to say? That I'd been hoping he'd ask? That leaving felt like abandoning something precious before I'd even understood what it was? That in the span of one evening, this man had made me feel more seen and understood than I had in years? I don't want to, I said finally, the honesty of it surprising us both. I don't want to go. Relief flooded his features so completely that I had to look away for a moment, overwhelmed by the intimacy of witnessing his naked gratitude. He stepped back from the doorway, creating space for me to return fully to his apartment, and I found myself crossing the threshold again, not just physically, but emotionally, stepping into territory that felt both terrifying and inevitable. He closed the door with careful deliberation, the soft click of the lock somehow more significant than it should have been. We were sealed in together now, just us and the growing sound of rain against glass and whatever was building between us with each shared glance and careful word. I should probably... Richard gestured vaguely toward the kitchen, toward the dinner dishes still scattered on the coffee table, anywhere but directly at me. We could... Would you like something to drink? I have wine or tea or... He was nervous, I realized, perhaps even more nervous than I was. This confident, thoughtful man who had talked me through my elevator panic with such steady calm was now fumbling for words, his usual grace replaced by an endearing uncertainty. Whatever you're having, I said gently. And Richard? Yeah? Breathe. He let out a shaky laugh and ran a hand through his hair. Right, breathing. Basic human function. I should probably remember how to do that. It's okay, I said, surprised by how much I meant it. I'm nervous too. Really? Really? This is... I searched for words to describe what this was. This feels important. And I'm not great with important. Something in my admission seemed to steady him, as if my vulnerability gave him permission for his own. He moved toward the kitchen with less of the jittery energy that had characterized his movements since I'd agreed to stay. Wine? He asked, already reaching for the bottle we'd opened earlier. Or are you more of a nightcap kind of person? I think I have some whiskey somewhere. Wine's perfect. I watched him pour 2 glasses with hands that were steadier now, noted the way he took extra care not to spill, the unconscious precision that spoke of years of living alone and taking care of himself. There was something both heartbreaking and beautiful about it. This man who had clearly mastered the art of solitary existence now trying to navigate the unfamiliar territory of sharing his space, his evening, his carefully guarded heart. The rain had intensified while we'd been talking, shifting from gentle drops to a steady rhythm that transformed the apartment into a cocoon of warmth and intimacy. Richard handed me a glass, and when our fingers brushed in the exchange, neither of us pulled away immediately. The contact lasted perhaps a second longer than necessary, but that second felt loaded with possibility. Should we sit? He asked, nodding toward the couch where we'd spent dinner talking about dreams deferred and lives half-lived. Yeah. But when we settled onto the leather sofa this time, something had shifted. We sat closer than before, not quite touching, but close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his body, close enough that I caught hints of his scent. Soap and something woodsy, maybe cedar, maybe just the essential smell of him. The silence that fell between us wasn't uncomfortable, but it was charged with awareness. I found myself hyper-conscious of every detail, the way he held his wine glass with both hands as if he needed something to anchor him, the way his breathing seemed slightly uneven, The way he kept glancing at me and then away, as if he couldn't quite believe I was still there. "I have a confession," he said finally, his voice soft in the lamplit room. "What's that?" "I've been thinking about you. Since the elevator, I mean. I kept catching myself listening for your footsteps in the hallway, hoping I might run into you by the mailboxes or in the lobby." He took a sip of wine, using the action to buy himself a moment of courage. "I thought about knocking on your door a dozen times, but I could never come up with a good excuse." The admission made something warm unfurl in my chest. "You didn't need an excuse." "I felt like I did. You made it pretty clear you weren't looking for neighborly connections." "I wasn't," I said honestly, "but that was before." "Before what?" I looked at him in the soft light, at the way his eyes seemed to hold depth and sadness and hope in equal measure, and tried to find words for the shift that had occurred in me over the course of our 2 conversations. Before I realized that maybe the reason I've been avoiding connections isn't because I don't want them, but because I've never found one that felt right. The words hung in the air between us, and I watched Richard's expression shift from uncertainty to something deeper, something that looked like recognition. "Right how?" he asked quietly. "Easy. Natural. Like I don't have to translate myself into someone more acceptable." I paused, surprised by my own honesty. "Like I can be quiet when I need to be quiet, and you won't take it as rejection. Like I can share the messy parts of my thoughts without having to apologize for them first." "Alex," he said, and my name in his voice sounded like something precious. "What?" "You don't have to apologize for anything with me." The simple statement hit me with unexpected force. When was the last time someone had given me that kind of unconditional acceptance? When had I stopped believing I deserved it? "Same goes for you," I said softly. "You don't have to perform being okay all the time. You don't have to have everything figured out." He set down his wine glass and turned to face me more fully, and I caught a glimpse of something raw and unguarded in his expression. I've spent so long being the person who helps other people with their problems that I forgot how to admit I have my own. "What kind of problems?" He was quiet for a long moment, and I waited, letting him find his way to whatever truth he needed to share. "I'm lonely," he said finally, and the admission seemed to cost him something significant. "I wake up every morning in an empty apartment and go to bed every night in an empty apartment, and somewhere in between I listen to other people talk about their relationships and their families and their connections, and I go home and pretend I don't want those things too." The honesty in his voice made my throat tight with emotion. Here was this beautiful, thoughtful man who had somehow convinced himself that his own needs for companionship were less valid than everyone else's. "Why do you pretend?" "Because wanting something you can't have is dangerous. Because admitting you're lonely feels like admitting you're not enough on your own. Because—" He stopped, shaking his head. "Because I've gotten comfortable with the safety of not trying." I recognized the sentiment immediately. The way we learn to protect ourselves from disappointment by lowering our expectations, by convincing ourselves we don't really want the things we're afraid we can't have. "But you asked me to stay," I pointed out gently. "That was trying." "That was terrifying," he corrected with a rueful smile. I almost talked myself out of it 3 times before the words came out. "What changed your mind?" He looked at me then with an expression so tender it made my chest ache. "You did. The way you've talked to me, really talked to me, like I'm a person instead of a role. The way you listen like you're actually interested in the answers instead of just waiting for your turn to speak." He paused, seeming to gather courage for what came next. "The way you make me feel less invisible." The way you make me feel less invisible. The words echoed something deep in my own experience, something I hadn't realized I'd been carrying until he named it. "I know exactly what you mean," I said. I've felt invisible for so long I started to think it was just who I was. But when you look at me, when you really look at me, I feel real. We were sitting closer now, though I couldn't say exactly when or how it had happened. Our knees were almost touching, and when Richard reached up to push a strand of hair back from his forehead, I caught myself following the movement with my eyes, noting the elegant line of his wrist, the way his fingers moved with unconscious grace. "Can I tell you something else?" he asked. "Anything." I haven't felt this nervous around someone in years. Good nervous, I mean. The kind that comes from caring about the outcome instead of just going through the motions. When was the last time you felt that way? He considered the question, his brow furrowing slightly in concentration. Honestly, I'm not sure I ever have. Even with David, my ex, I think I was more anxious about doing everything right than I was genuinely nervous about whether he'd like who I actually was. And now? Now I'm terrified you'll realize I'm just a middle-aged therapist with too many books and a tendency to overthink everything, and you'll decide you'd rather spend your evening with someone more exciting. The vulnerability in his admission made something fierce and protective rise in my chest. Richard. Yeah? I don't want exciting. I want real. I want someone who reads books that make them think and isn't afraid to sit with complicated emotions. I want someone who notices when I'm struggling and doesn't try to fix me, just keeps me company while I figure it out myself. His eyes were bright with something that looked like hope mixed with disbelief. Is that really what you want? It's what I want with you. The words came out softer than I'd intended, but they felt true in a way that surprised me. I wasn't sure when exactly it had happened, but somewhere in the space between our elevator conversation and this moment on his couch, my feelings had shifted from simple attraction to something deeper and more significant. Richard reached out then, slowly, giving me every opportunity to pull away, and brushed his fingertips against my cheek. The touch was feather-light, reverent, as if he couldn't quite believe he was allowed this intimacy. "Alex," he whispered, and there was wonder in his voice. "Yeah? I'm really glad you stayed." Before I could respond, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to mine, soft, tentative, a question asked and answered in the space of a heartbeat. The kiss was nothing like I'd expected, and everything I hadn't known I needed. Not passionate or desperate, but tender, careful, filled with a restraint that spoke of years of wanting something exactly like this. When we broke apart, we stayed close, foreheads nearly touching, breathing the same air in the lamp-lit quiet of his living room. "Was that okay?" he asked, and his voice was rough with emotion. Instead of answering with words, I kissed him again, letting my response speak for itself. This time there was less hesitation, more certainty, though the tenderness remained. His lips were soft and warm, and he tasted faintly of wine and something that was purely him. When we separated this time, I could see that the kiss had affected him as profoundly as it had me. His pupils were dilated, his breathing slightly uneven, and there was a flush of color across his cheekbones that made him look younger, less guarded. "That was," he started, then trailed off, shaking his head. "Yeah," I agreed. "It was." We settled back against the couch cushions, but closer now, the space between us negotiated and claimed. Richard's arm found its way around my shoulders, and I let myself lean into his warmth, marveling at how perfectly I seemed to fit against his side. The rain had intensified into a proper downpour, drumming against the windows with a rhythm that seemed to wrap around the apartment like a protective barrier. In the soft glow of the table lamps, with Richard's arm around me and the sound of the storm outside, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the sense of being exactly where I belonged. "Tell me about your dreams," Richard said quietly, his breath stirring my hair. "The ones you've never said out loud." The request should have felt too intimate, too soon, but with my head resting against his shoulder and his fingers tracing absent patterns on my arm, it felt natural to share the secret wishes I'd barely acknowledged to myself. I dream about Sunday mornings that stretch into Sunday afternoons, I said. About someone who doesn't mind that I'm not a morning person, who'll bring me coffee in bed and won't take it personally if I need an hour to become human. I paused, surprised by how easy it was to be honest with him. I dream about having someone to cook for, someone who'll appreciate the effort even if the meal doesn't turn out perfectly. What else? I dream about traveling somewhere together. Not necessarily anywhere exotic, just somewhere that matters to both of us. I want to experience new places with someone who sees the world the way I do, who notices the same details and finds beauty in the same small moments. Richard's hand stilled in my hair. That sounds beautiful. What about you? What do you dream about when you let yourself dream? He was quiet for so long I thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft with longing. I dream about not feeling like I have to earn affection through usefulness. About someone wanting to spend time with me when I'm not solving their problems or offering advice, just because they enjoy my company. He paused, and I felt him take a steadying breath. I dream about lazy Saturday mornings and shared dinners and someone who doesn't mind that I cry at movies or that I talk to myself when I'm concentrating. I wouldn't mind any of those things, I said quietly. No? I tilted my head to look up at him. No. I think they're all part of what makes you who you are. And I like who you are. The smile that spread across his face was radiant, transforming his entire expression. I like who I am when I'm with you, too. I feel more like myself than I have in years. What do you mean? I mean, I'm not performing right now. I'm not trying to be the wise therapist or the perfectly composed adult or any other role I usually slip into. I'm just me. Nervous, hopeful, slightly overwhelmed me. I reached up and touched his cheek, letting my palm rest against the slight roughness of evening stubble. I like this version of you. The real version. He leaned into my touch, closing his eyes for a moment as if savoring the contact. When he opened them again, they were bright with unshed tears. I haven't let anyone see the real version in a very long time, he admitted. Why not? Because the real version is messy, uncertain, sometimes lonely and scared and not nearly as put together as people expect me to be. The real version is also kind and thoughtful and brave enough to ask a stranger to stay when you could have just let me walk away. Was it brave? It felt more like desperation. Sometimes those are the same thing. We kissed again then, slow and deep and full of all the things we were learning about each other in the space between words. When we broke apart, I realized we'd shifted position without conscious thought. I was half turned toward him, my legs tucked under me, close enough to see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. Alex, he said softly. Yeah? I need to tell you something. The seriousness in his tone made my stomach flutter with anxiety. What? This isn't casual for me. I know we just met. I know it's too soon to be talking about feelings, but I need you to know that whatever this is, it matters to me. You matter to me. Relief flooded through me so completely I felt dizzy with it. It's not casual for me either. I've never felt anything like this before. Like what? I struggled to find words for the warmth that had taken up residence in my chest, the way his presence seemed to quiet some anxious part of my mind I hadn't even realized was constantly chattering. Like coming home, I said finally, like finding something I didn't know I was looking for. Richard's eyes filled with tears that didn't quite fall. That's exactly what it feels like. The admission hung between us like a bridge we could choose to cross or abandon. I looked at this man who had somehow become essential to me in the space of a single evening, at the vulnerability written across his features, at the hope and fear warring in his expression. Richard, Yeah, I'm scared. Of what? Of how much I already care. Of how much I want this to be real. Of the fact that I'm sitting here planning a future with someone I met yesterday. He smiled then, tender and understanding. I'm scared too. But maybe being scared together is better than being safe and alone. Is that what we're doing? Being scared together? I hope so, if you want to be. I answered by kissing him again, pouring all my hope and fear and desperate longing into the contact. This time, when we broke apart, we stayed close, sharing breath and space and the profound intimacy of choosing vulnerability over safety. The rain outside had settled into a steady rhythm, no longer the dramatic downpour of earlier, but a gentle, persistent percussion that seemed designed to last through the night. Richard reached for the throw blanket draped over the back of the couch and pulled it over both of us, creating a cocoon of warmth and closeness. "Stay with me tonight," he said quietly. "I mean, really stay. Not because the weather's bad or because it's late, but because you want to." "I want to," I said without hesitation. "I want to very much." We settled more comfortably against each other, my head finding the perfect hollow between his shoulder and chest, where his heartbeat was steady and strong beneath my ear. His arms tightened around me, holding me against him as if he still couldn't quite believe I was choosing to stay. "Is this okay?" he asked, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "This is perfect." And it was. Despite the strangeness of the circumstances, despite how quickly everything had developed, despite all the reasons it should have felt too soon or too intense, lying there in Richard's arms felt like the most natural thing in the world. We talked quietly as the evening deepened, about books we'd loved, places we wanted to see, the small disappointments and unexpected joys that had shaped us. But mostly we just held each other, content to exist in the same space, to breathe the same air, to marvel at the improbable series of events that had led us to this moment. At some point, I felt Richard's breathing even out into the deeper rhythm of sleep, though his arms never loosened their hold on me. I stayed awake a little longer, listening to the rain and the steady beat of his heart, trying to memorize every detail of this perfect, impossible night. Just before I drifted off, I realized that for the first time in years, I wasn't thinking about all the ways this could go wrong or all the reasons I should protect myself. Instead, I was thinking about tomorrow morning, about waking up in Richard's arms, about coffee and conversation and the luxury of not having to pretend this was just a casual encounter. The last thing I was conscious of was Richard murmuring my name in his sleep, his voice soft with contentment, and the sound of rain against glass that seemed to promise shelter from whatever storms might come. When I woke the next morning, pale sunlight was filtering through the windows, and Richard was still there, still real, still holding me like I was something precious worth protecting. His eyes were already open, watching me with an expression of wonder and gratitude that made my chest tight with emotion. "Good morning," he said softly. "Good morning. How did you sleep?" "Better than I have in years. You?" "Same." He brushed a strand of hair back from my forehead with gentle fingers. "I kept waking up just to make sure you were still here." "I'm still here," I confirmed. "I'm not going anywhere." The promise hung in the air between us, fragile and new, but strengthened by the warmth of morning light and the reality of having made it through the night together. Whatever came next, whatever challenges we'd face as we learned to navigate this unexpected connection, we'd face them together. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, that felt like more than enough. It felt like everything.